It is now my pleasure to welcome back to the stage the UN Secretary General's Youth Envoy, JAYATHMA, as well as our UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador and YouTube creator, Lilly Singh, and Mashable's Editor-in-Chief, Jessica Cohen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for joining us
This is
today.
much larger than it looked backstage.
Yeah, no, it's very comfortable.
I know. Jeez, I'm just going to do this. Hello.
Lots of space. So, JAYATHMA, let's start with you. As the envoy on youth, it's a relatively new position, and you are only the second person to hold it. If you could briefly outline for us what this job is all about, and also your path to taking this role.
Sure. So first of all, let me give a big shout out to my predecessor, Ahmad Al-Hindawi, who did an amazing job and really created that space and that institution for me to build up on. And my role really as the United Nations Secretary General's Envoy on Youth is to be an advisor and a representative of the Secretary General when it comes to all matters pertaining to young people. So this could be young people and sustainable development, young people and peace building, young people and human rights, or young people in humanitarian action. But we also don't have a lot of young people working for the UN. So I also do a night job, which is being the youth voice in the UN, and try to shake things up a little bit and try to be innovative and creative in the way that the United Nations, as this huge bureaucracy, engages with young people and future generations.
Wonderful. And Lilly, superwoman.
Hey.
Yeah, like, yeah.
Hi.
14 million subscribers. Who doesn't have that?
Right.
Couple billion views, and now the UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador. And you are the first Goodwill Ambassador who's a digital first ambassador, right? Like your
First
rise
from the digital space, yeah.
Right, that's your rise to fame. Can you explain how having that unique platform has informed your decision to get involved?
Yeah, well, I think the good thing about the internet is that kids are on it. And I think, and I think the more and more I have these conversations with adults or older people, there's a little bit of a disconnect where they don't understand the experience of young people or the voice of young people, and they're like, what does this acronym mean? My mom, they don't understand the internet so much, and so I think being able to tell stories to youth and really hearing their experiences has led me to understand what it's like to be a young person. Even though I myself am not the youngest person, I understand the experience of younger people, and I think it's understanding that experience is so important when you talk about the issues these young people face. And so, seeing the age of social media where there's bullying, there's cyberbullying, there's just so much more kids have to deal with today, it led me to the decision that we need to think about things differently when we think about youth issues.
Absolutely, and the digital landscape and the social media landscape, as you're pointing out here, it's completely changed. And for worse, as you're outlining, but also for better. Yep. And JAYATHMA, you have experience with that, right?
Yes, so you asked me in the earlier question, which I forgot to answer, about my path towards getting to this job. I co-founded a movement called #Generation in my country with a few of my friends. The idea was to really to use hashtags to convey our messages. The messaging was for young people in my country to come out and vote, to be actively participating in elections, both as voters, but also actively encouraging young people to run for office, especially young women. My country was one of the first countries that produced the world's first female prime minister, but currently we only have about 5% women in parliament. That is one of the lowest rates in the world. So I wanted to do something about it together with my friends. So we didn't have any resources, we didn't have a lot of money or capital. We found social media as a tool that was freely available to us to mobilize more and more of our peers. So we started using hashtags to create that awareness, and then later converted those hashtags or those words into concrete action by conducting workshops with young people in the communities, by going to villages and communities to encourage young people to go out and vote and also to run for office.
So we've got 1.8 billion people on Earth who are between the ages of 10 and 24, and a lot of them do have access to social media, but we're also talking about communities that don't have access at all, and they're both hard to reach and hard to hear. What are we identifying as a key problem in that area? What have you seen in that regard?
In terms of access to...
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. I recently went to India. My parents are from India. I've been to India many times, but I went to Madhya Pradesh, which I've never been to before, and I went to a rural community, and you'd think that, you know, I was like, oh, there's clearly a lack of access to the internet or information or knowledge. And then I noticed that every single person, regardless of their economic status, had a cell phone. Because in India, having a cell phone is more affordable than having a toilet even. So people would have cell phones. And so I was like, okay, well, if everyone has a cell phone, all these kids watch YouTube and all these kids are on the internet, why is there such a disconnect with information? So I started this campaign where, as a pre-roll ad on YouTube, youth would be told about a kids' helpline to help against violence, child marriage, laws that are there to protect the youth, but they just don't know about. And so I really think it's just about creative solutions. It's about going into these places, not being outside and assuming what's going on in these places, but going inside and creatively thinking of solutions and how to get people connected.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
I think similar to India,
yes.
Lily, in my travels in Africa, I also found the same scenario. Even in areas where you don't have access to electricity, young people sometimes walk miles to get their phones recharged to find electricity. But I also observed a gap there. Young boys or young men had more access to these services than young women. So there's a huge digital gender divide, if I can say so, that young women, first of all, they don't get access to even basic schooling or primary education, which of course imparts their ability to receive digital education or digital access. And that discrimination that young women should stay back and young men should go out and get those services is something I think we also need to address in that conversation.
Yeah,
sorry.
No, I was just going to say I think that's a really important point, because I think in any conversation you have with education or access, there's definitely a cultural shift that has to happen in terms of gender equality, and that is the case in so many places around the world.
What steps is the UN taking right now to address this very specific problem when it comes to gender equality and access to these platforms, such that youth can have a voice no matter what gender they are?
That question couldn't come at a better time. So tomorrow, the UN is launching our first ever youth strategy. So the Secretary General Antonio Guterres tomorrow at 12 noon, tune in, will be launching the United Nations Youth Strategy. So the strategy really comes in an opportune moment, as you said. 1.8 billion young people between the ages of 10 to 24, and 30%, if you take the percentage under the age of 30, then it's half of the population. So you can't really ignore that huge of a population. So taking that into account and then thinking seriously, you know, if we are serious about achieving sustainable development, if we are serious about ending hunger, ending poverty, and reversing climate change, this is the generation that is going to do it. We have seen change so far, we have seen growth, but that growth has been incremental. We can't afford to have incremental change anymore. We need exponential growth, we need exponential change, and we can do it if we mobilize this entire generation. So the United Nations is recommitting itself to empower young people, but also to give young people a platform to be able to raise their voice, concerns, and most importantly, like the 17 young leaders that you saw, to bring their solutions to the table.
Now, your work with UNICEF.
I'm obsessed with her. She's so
I know, right?
Like, I'm obsessed. Are you all also obsessed? I feel like I'm obsessed.
I feel like we're done. We're done. Okay. So your work with UNICEF is focused on schools, especially most recently, and violence in schools. And here in the States, it's very easy to get into a bubble and think about our firearms crisis and gun control and whatnot. But we're talking about the UN here. We're talking about a much bigger global issue. Can you enlighten us on that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I've been fortunate enough to travel to a lot of places in the world, and you're absolutely right. When I come from North America, I'm like, okay, so we're talking about bullying, possibly not having enough teachers, maybe the teachers go on strike. Like, these are all the things I dealt with in my life. And then you go to places like Kenya and South Africa and India, and you learn that there's some serious issues that students face in school, if they even, first of all, get the opportunity to go to school. And then on top of that, there's violence from teachers, there's corporal punishment, there's sexual harassment, there's being discriminated based on the caste you're from. There's just so many issues that students face in school that don't allow them to get a proper education. Like they might be in the classroom if they're fortunate enough to get there, but even still the environment does not lend itself well to actually getting a quality education. And I mean, a lot of us can probably relate. What are the things you complained about in school? I complained about my lecture being too long. My psych lecture was too long. And so when I visit these places and I see these environments, it just really, it's kind of like giving someone an opportunity, but then not really. You know, it's like you get to go to school, but you're not really going to get to learn because you're going to face all these challenges. And so I think it's really important to make sure people get a quality education and that their schools are violin-free.
I think that's a very strong point about you can get in, but you can't have it all. It's how
You can kind of get in, maybe, if you're lucky in these areas.
Yeah.
Exactly. But then if you get in, it's still very, very difficult.
So when it comes to that situation and you have groups that are not being treated fairly and not having full access to the resources that other groups might have in that very same school, you have a situation where there are groups that have basic skills that are lacking. And with the UN, what have you guys identified as being the most important skills that are lacking where we can target?
Well, I recently read a World Economic Forum report which said that 30% of the skills that were relevant in 2015 are not going to be relevant in 2020. So in 5 years, 30% of the skills that we learn are going to expire, largely due to the technological advancements and the rapid growth in different sectors that we see right now. So I think we have to go back and think, what are we teaching young people in school? What should we be teaching young people in school? Should formal education or classroom education be enough? Shouldn't we be thinking about informal and non-formal education? Shouldn't we teach young people learn to learn so that in a rapidly changing world, throughout their life cycles, they can learn? And then having flexible, adaptable, soft skills that will help them get into new environments, but also to be resilient for those challenges is something that I think we need to keep in mind, especially in the context of the fourth industrial revolution.
When it comes to making sure that the youth have these skills, we should listen to them, right? When we have limited access to them, that becomes difficult. But why is it so important that we need to hear their account of what's missing?
Yeah, you know, going back to my previous answer of working on the internet has really allowed me to understand people that are younger than me. I still will not be able to fully experience what they go through on a day-to-day basis, but I understand the overall picture of you cannot be an adult and assume you know what it's like to be a youth in today's age. Because let's be real, any adult today did not have social media when they were growing up. They did not have all the things that kids have access to these days. The perfect example I can give you is when, on my recent trip to South Africa, one of the initiatives there is, okay, we want people to practice safe sex. We're gonna put condoms in this pharmacy. And a bunch of adults came about and they said, this is a great solution, we're gonna do this. Well, why is there still such a crisis? And all it took was asking the kids, like, hey, why is this not working? And the kids will have a list of reasons. Well, the pharmacist judges you. Everyone gets made fun of when you walk in there. There's such a stigma attached to getting condom. Our boyfriends don't want to talk about this. You would not know those issues if you don't involve kids in the conversation. And so I think it's important to remember that no decision should be made about kids without kids.
Exactly. Amen.
What can't adults teach kids?
That's interesting.
What can't adults teach kids?
Basically, what decisions they should make. I don't think anyone can tell young people what decisions people should be making about themselves. Just to also piggyback on what Lilly said earlier, about our lives, about our bodies, about the way that we live our day-to-day lives, we should have a say in that. But also when it comes to big global conversations, you know, conversations about climate change, we are the generation that is going to live with the implications of climate change. We are the generation that's going to decarbonize this atmosphere in the next 40, 50 years. So all these policy conversations, negotiations, laws about climate change should have our voices reflected because we are going to live with those consequences. So I don't think it is fair for any generation or anyone to come to young people and say, oh, we've decided what's right for you, now go and implement it. I think we need a seat at the table. If the tables are not big enough, we need to make them bigger. We need to put aside the chairs and create more space so that young people can participate in discussions that affect their lives.
And I also think
Let's just keep clapping at each other.
we're just like fangirling over each other. This is what this is about. I also think to go back to what you were saying, I love what you said about we need to teach children to learn how to learn, because you need to be a student. The best educators are people who are students for their whole lives. I always believe that's very important to learn. But I also think adults can't teach kids how to implement change, because I think previously, if you look in history, a lot of magnificent changes happened by people who are now adults. But if you were just to repeat those same things, that wouldn't be change, it would be repetition. And so I think our generation is so great is because they're very innovative. They love to be entrepreneurs. They love to think outside the box. They do things in a way that things have never been done before. I mean, my career is a testament to that. Making videos on the internet. When I told my parents this, they were like, what are you talking about? This is not a thing. And so I think it's also not teaching kids how to change. This generation will change things in a way that previous generations would have never thought about, in a way that they didn't think was possible. So I think, don't think inside the box, think outside the box when it comes to change.
There's a real urgency here that is quite obvious, and yet there's still this sense that the voices of youth aren't necessarily taken as seriously as they should be. What needs to happen both immediately, and what steps can be taken to change the way adults think about the youth voice?
I think, as Lilly said earlier, we need a cultural change. We need a cultural shift. I mean, I come from South Asia, from a very patriarchal society where in most of our homes, we can't even have a say in the decisions that are made inside our own families or our homes. We're not expected to talk back at our parents or challenge our parents' decisions or standpoints of view. But it's also common in many other parts of the world that I've seen, in Africa to Latin America, also in some parts of Europe. So that needs to change. I mean, we live in such challenging times. We need everyone's voices to be heard. We need everyone's potential. We need everyone's contribution to make sure that in the face of those challenges, we are together, and that together we make sure that everyone is protected, everyone is safe, and that everyone can have a say in the decisions that are being made about their lives.
Right, and I also think that there's over 200 million young people who are not in school around the world. That's an unacceptable stat, I feel. School not only teaches you, when I reflect back on my education, yes, I learned specific things in school. I learned about Freud and psychology, but the things that school taught me were self-esteem, how to speak out, how to have confidence, how to interact with people. Those skills are so crucial to young people, and the fact that so many young people are not in school is no longer acceptable at this time where we live right now. We need to get young kids in school across the world, especially young women, because, and this is not just my opinion, I'm not just saying this because I'm a girl, this is factually, scientifically proven. All the men in the world as well, please listen, this is scientifically proven that the world would be a better place if more young women were in school.
So is access to education, do we consider access to education the #1 problem?
Well, I would say it is among the #1 problems, because as I said in our backstage conversation, I always say it's the best of the times to be a young person, but it's also the worst of the times. It's the best of the times if you look at this so far, right? We have had the opportunities, we have had that access, we have had quality education. You, Lilly, have had an access to internet, a great platform that you can make your voice heard. But there's also young people. We have about 64 million young people who are unemployed as we speak. We have about 600 million young people living in conflict-affected areas or areas affected by organized violence. In our refugee camps, we find humongous amount of young people who are spending 10, 15 years of their lives without having access to basic education, training, any opportunities to be civically or politically or socially active. As Lilly very correctly said, in many parts of the world, young girls and young women are disproportionately affected by poverty, by climate change, and by access to justice. So these issues, we cannot address one without the other, because they're all interlinked. If we're talking about technology, we have to talk about the gender dimension in technology. If you're talking about climate change, we have to talk about the interlinkage between climate change and peace and security. So I wouldn't really rate one thing as the world's #1 problem, but for young people, it is an existential crisis. If we do not address these problems with the agency that it needs to be, then we might even not have a planet to live in. So for us, I would say it's an issue of existence.
I couldn't agree more. She nailed it.
does know.
That was our answer collectively.
One last question,
Yep.
which is that we go through these problems and they are considerable and it can feel overwhelming, but that's not what this is about. This is about what we can do. And a lot of people in this room don't have a kid at home who's 13 who they can speak with. A lot of people don't have access to the youth who need the help most. So we walk out of here today, what's the thing we do?
I mean, it starts with our day-to-day life, right? You don't have to be in Paris in climate negotiations to do something about climate change. You can just switch off the light when you leave a room. You can stop using plastic bags or plastic straws. You can start riding a bike to go to work instead of your car. So there are small things that we can do in our day-to-day life. But imagine 7 billion people doing all of these things together at one given day. Then that will make a huge impact in the way that we live and the way that the world goes in advance.
I'd also say it's about education. I mean, all of us are so fortunate in this room to be able to go and seek information should we need it. And so when I first started my journey on, okay, I want to, the mistreatment of women really annoys me. I didn't just sit at home and be annoyed. I then learned about it and I met wonderful people like this and I educated myself on the topic. So I think if there's something you want to change in the world, proactively go and learn about it and learn about how you can change it, because you are all very capable of implementing some sort of change in the world and you're all very fortunate enough to be able to have access to the resources you need to do so. So I'd say find something that you want to change and then change it.
Exactly. Go for it.
Very strong points, proactively educating yourself, right? We are out of time, but I want to thank you both for taking
Also,
the time.
thank you to our wonderful
Thank you,
moderator.
Jessica.
Amazing job.
You make my job very easy. So on that note, I think we're wrapping up. So
Yeah.
thank you both very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm your #1 fan.